Something like that. I don't. That's what happened.
But I never logged in.
Yeah, that's right. I never log in from this happened. Log out.
Hello? Hello?
It's not for trace, it's for everything. It's your logging out with everything and logging back in.
I always log in.
I'll look at it right away.
Okay. Can everyone hear? Is this on? Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the final talk in the Astro Colloquium series. And Anya will introduce herself. Oh wait, no, I'm going to do it first. Sorry. That would make the most sense. Okay, I'm Aitna. I'm a student here. Well, I'm a student at Columbia, but I'm interning here this summer. I'm not part of the Astro REU, but I'm working with Matt Ashby in the infrared group. So I'm tangentially associated.
Hello, I'm Anya. I go to Ohio State, and I'm working here this summer with Cecilia Garofo. So today, we would like to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Caroline Nowlan. Dr. Nowlan hails from New Brunswick, Canada, where she attended Mount Allison University in Sackville for her bachelor's degree, as one of only about 5 physics majors in her class. As an undergraduate, she conducted research in spectroscopy at the National Research Council in Ottawa, and after attending a physics conference where she heard a talk about satellites in the atmosphere, she decided to go into atmospheric science. Dr. Nowlan went on to complete her master's degree and PhD at the University of Toronto, advised by Jim Drummond, and funded by the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada Fellowship. There, she worked part-time on a small team at Environment and Climate Change Canada on a satellite mission, and on that project she had the opportunity to work on many scientific and engineering aspects, including lab work and instrument testing in a vacuum chamber. While in Toronto, she also tested a prototype of a high-altitude balloon, which launched at 50 kilometers.
And after completing her PhD and backpacking around the world for a year, Dr. Nowlan came here to the CFA as a postdoctoral fellow, and then moved back to Canada in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and worked there for a year as a research associate at Dalhousie University. In 2013, she moved back to Cambridge, where she has since worked in her current position on the TEMPO mission that she'll be talking about today. And during her time at the CFA, she's been involved in multiple outreach efforts, including working with the Science Education Department, advising students in the Latino Initiative program for the past several years, and mentoring research projects for local high school students. In her free time, Dr. Nowlan enjoys playing the mandolin and Irish fiddle, learning the piano, and running as, quote, forced exercise. She is also a nature enthusiast, spending time in her garden, and having grown up as an equestrian and working in stables during her early adulthood. With that being said, please join us in welcoming Dr. Nowlan.
Well, thank you for the most thorough introduction that I have had. I also had 2 kids during that time, which I feel is like one of my my most exhausting and impressive feats. So today I'll be talking about measuring air pollution from space with the TEMPO instrument. My title might be slightly misleading in a way because I think for the first half of the talk I'm really just going to talk generally about how we make these measurements from space, and then I'm going to talk about TEMPO. And I should start off by saying that I'm not going to show any real TEMPO data. And I apologize if you are here because you were expecting TEMPO data. So TEMPO was launched in April, and we made the first measurements on Monday night of the sun. For 2 nights, solar measurements were made, and then yesterday we did the first scans of the Earth. And everything looks as expected. The spectra look really nice. But there's going to be a NASA-Smithsonian announcement in 2 or 3 weeks, and we've been told that we should not leak anything. If this wasn't on YouTube, I might be able to show a solar spectrum. But you can come to my office if you're interested, and I will show you things. I was told I could maybe put up an intro slide. I wasn't sure what you were going to say, but basically, and to talk a little bit about graduate school, I think. So, which I guess is a while ago for me now. But yeah, so as you heard, I did my undergraduate at a small liberal arts school in Canada that probably nobody here has heard of. When I moved to Toronto, half the people there hadn't heard of it either. It's one of the smallest schools in Canada. There's 2,000 people. And I went there to University of Toronto, which is one of the largest universities in North America. I think now there's 100,000 people at U of T. But I worked on a Canadian satellite mission that is actually still in space. It was launched 20 years ago, and it's still operating. It measures ozone primarily in the middle atmosphere. And this was a small project, so it cost about $6 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but for a satellite mission, that is not a lot. So that was Canadian dollars too. So in US dollars, it's about 5% of the cost of Tempo, which also is not actually an extremely expensive satellite mission. So there were not very many of us, and I got to do everything during this time. And if anyone has the opportunity, not saying working on a cheap, small project is a good thing, but doing a variety of things during graduate school, I found really interesting and rewarding and set me up later for understanding what other people are doing in my field. So I worked in the field. I worked in labs with instruments. I worked in the field. So this is up here on the left is a helium balloon being filled. These were launched. We launch these every couple of years from Saskatchewan. This is about 24 stories high when it's filled with helium. Those two little things on the end, those are people. And it used, I think, something like 1% of the world's helium production for 1 year went into that single balloon. So that's a helium tanker right there. These were launched at night because the surface winds were very low in Saskatchewan at night. And so when you're launching a 24-story balloon, you have to put it on a truck. Well, this is how they did it anyway back then. They put it on the end of a truck, and the truck would drive down the runway, and then the balloon would be launched. And if you have any surface wind, then things can go bad. Your instruments could be dragged on the ground or something. So my first job as a master's student was actually to rebuild a power supply for an instrument that went on this balloon that had been riddled by bullets 2 years previously. That's a really long story for another talk. But that Chinese balloon that was shot down last year, it's not the first. So there was a Canadian balloon, this Canadian campaign. One of the balloons did not come down when it was supposed to. This was in 1998, and it was brought down eventually by fighter jets from the US, British, and Canadian Air Forces in Finland. So that's another story. And this is me working in a clean room. So satellite instruments have to be kept very clean. You can't have any contamination. When you put a satellite instrument into space, you're not going to just be able to, say, clean a mirror or something like that. So you have to be very clean. And so I got to do that as well. In the end, I actually worked primarily on data analysis. And so I got to do a lot of different things. And then I came to the CFA. It was suggested I give some advice for potential graduate students. That's just, maybe some of you will not be going to graduate school, but I feel kind of funny giving advice because I'm sure that I didn't follow any of this advice, and I don't even necessarily do now. I think make sure you do things like get enough sleep. I did not do that in graduate school, and actually I made this talk at 10:30 last night, so I'm still not following my own advice necessarily. And exercise, I think those should be like the priorities before you actually do any data analysis or write a paper. And I think looking for an advisor who will help you network and send you to conferences, that was a really useful thing for me. My advisor was just like, do you want to go to China? I'd say, okay. And you can meet so many people, if you have somebody who's willing to help you out in that way. And also, I don't think my boss is here, but I would say that, I don't know what he thinks, but you can actually be a scientist by working 40 hours a week. I was scared in graduate school. I'd look at people who are working all the time, and I thought, oh, I have to do that too. And I don't think that you have to. I think you can actually compress that, if you're efficient, into a regular working day. And also, once you have children, then you're forced to, and that was my case. And I think I was more efficient after I had kids, which is strange to say. Maybe not everybody feels that way, but I did. So now let's get into the actual talk. So I have several people who contributed to figures or text to these slides. But the TEMPO mission is a big mission, and there's a lot of people involved. So this is from a photo from our last science team meeting. This was at the University of Alabama. I had to look up that flag. I'm not American. I was like, what is that flag? It's the flag of Alabama, in case you probably all know that. But this is the University of Alabama. And we had about 120 people in person, and we had about 200 online. In the beginning, I was saying earlier to someone that our meetings were like 40 or 50 people, but as the instrument got closer to launch, people are getting really excited about it. So first, let's start off by thinking about what's in the air you breathe. Now, maybe this is something that you have not thought about at all if you're lucky and you live in a clean area, and it's something that some people probably think about a lot. But I think things change probably in the last couple months here. There's obviously been a lot of, unless you've been inside for 2 months, you will have noticed that there was a lot of wildfire smoke in the northeastern US. In Boston, it's actually not been that bad compared to a lot of places in the Midwest and New York and DC, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. But I think this is definitely more on the radar than it was. At least here, in places like California, people are having to think about this a lot every year. So I didn't have to go far to find easily hundreds of recent news articles about poor air quality in this area, and it was almost like a fight to have who had the worst air quality on a given day. One day it was DC. Then it was Chicago, it was Toronto, New York City. Worst air quality in the world doesn't usually go to these cities. The United States, relative to some other countries in the world, in 2023 at least, has relatively clean cities compared to some places. I mean, there's certain ones that are very polluted still, like LA and New York, but on the grand scale of things, they're not usually the worst in the world. So I think everyone knows that poor air quality affects health. So I'll just go through a few of the things that air quality affects, but the first one we'll talk about is health. So in the US, about 70,000 people die prematurely from poor air quality every year. Globally, and there's also the chronic disease that I can't remember the numbers on that, but that's even larger. Globally, it's an even bigger problem. So globally, the World Health Organization last estimate is that 4.2 million people die every year from poor air quality, but recent studies indicate this may be more like up to 8 million people, and that's outdoor air quality. So I don't remember the exact number, but an almost equal number, or maybe it's half, die from poor indoor air quality. So not necessarily here, but in lots of places. There's, say, cooking that's done in the house with fuels that cause poor air quality, and so that's a problem in a lot of countries as well. But we're talking about outside air, or ambient air quality, we call it. So there's certain things that poor air quality can cause, and some of them are obvious. Things like asthma, respiratory disease, lung cancer, but it's also linked strongly with preterm birth, heart disease, things like stroke and diabetes that you would not necessarily think of, and recently dementia and other conditions. And it's not entirely clear why in some cases, but it's probable that fine particles in the atmosphere, so a lot of people have heard of PM 2.5, because of COVID, but these are the really tiny particles in the atmosphere that are less than 2.5 microns in diameter. They can enter your lungs and your bloodstream because they're so small, and that can lead to inflammation in the body. The strongest links are with fine particulate matter, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. And these are actually all things that TEMPO measures. So poor air quality also affects ecosystems. So it can lead to eutrophication. That is a word I actually only learned when I started doing air quality. But nitrogen is a plant nutrient, and so plants like nitrogen and they grow, but if you have some plants if you have plants that really like nitrogen, they will grow more than some other plants, and you get a loss of biodiversity. You can get algae blooms in water bodies, and often that comes from like fertilizer runoff, but it can also be contributed to by air pollution. And that leads to loss of biodiversity because the algae will, for several reasons, but it will when it dies, it goes to the bottom. Microbes eat it, use up oxygen in the water, and then that affects fish health and other plants. So when I was younger, acid rain was a big deal. It's a lot better now, but it's still a problem in some places. And so when you have sulfur and nitrogen in the air, that has to go somewhere eventually. So it's emitted, but that's a source. We call it a sink when it leaves the atmosphere. And it can leave either through like raindrops or just the motions of air it sticks to the earth or to vegetation. And so you can get acidification of soil and water that way. And ozone damage. So ozone up high in the stratosphere, that's good, it protects us from UV radiation, but when it's at the ground, it's a pollutant. And so ozone is bad for people's lungs, for tissue, and also for vegetation and crops. So this is a leaf that is showing ozone damage. And when you have crops affected, in some parts of the world, you say could have like a 10% reduction in rice or maize production if you have a lot of ozone. That has serious economic impacts. Then climate. So I won't talk too much about climate, but air quality, except on this slide, air quality and climate are really hard to separate. Sometimes in our field we actually talk about them separately, like greenhouse gases and air quality gases, but some air quality gases are actually greenhouse gases, for instance, ozone. Through atmospheric chemistry, they're all really intimately connected, and they also often have the same sources. So some examples are that nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, when they combine in the atmosphere, they form ozone. So ozone is not emitted directly as a pollutant. It's like a secondary pollutant that comes from other chemical reactions. And ozone in the lower atmosphere is a greenhouse gas. And they can also produce secondary organic aerosols. Again, these are like fine particles. And those actually have cooling effects. So they scatter light back to space. And so, and aerosols in climate models are actually one of the biggest uncertainties in these models. And so it's all tied into air quality and gases as well. As well, you can have feedbacks. If you have hotter conditions, you can get more smog and ozone production. If it's drier, you can get more wildfires and particle pollution from dust. And then there's lots of other ways they're connected through atmospheric chemistry. Certain emissions will interact with some other molecule that then can't interact with a different molecule, say methane, and so methane's lifetime has changed, things like that. Cloud formation, plant growth, all kinds of stuff. So here's a map of surface monitors of particle pollution, and I just took this from a few days ago. If you're like me, you looked at this a lot in June, and this is the EPA's smoke map. So this is monitors on the ground measuring smoke particles, or actually any particles, but at this, it's this summer it's mostly smoke. This is a really clean day, actually. I should have liked a screen capture from a day when everything was purple. So in green means the air quality is good, yellow is moderate. For a while there was a lot of dark purple hazardous points all over the Northeast and Midwest. But the thing to look at here is that we have a lot of data points, but we also have a lot of space that's not covered. So for instance, do I have a pointer here? Yeah. So the central United States, big areas of Canada, large areas of Mexico have no monitors. Now that was particle pollution, but we also were worried about gases too. So this is an EPA map showing the locations of monitors that measure nitrogen dioxide in the United States. And again, it looks like there's quite a lot of them. And the EPA uses hundreds of these reference monitors. They're mostly maintained and deployed by state agencies, but the EPA collects all the data together. And this is used for like regulatory purposes. And these provide continuous monitoring of the air that we're breathing at the surface, like day and night. So they're very useful. If you zoom in on an area like ours, you can start to look and see that actually some areas are quite sparse. So we have maybe 3 in Boston, and then a few others in Massachusetts, and a few in New York. If you look back here, you'll notice some places like Idaho have 1. So not a lot. So the surface observations can be sparse, and the reason this is a problem with something like NO2 is that NO2 is actually a short-lived gas. It's only in the air for a few hours. So if it's emitted from a power plant and then the wind blows the other way, you don't have any NO2 there, a couple hours later, or the NO2 is produced in some event and then it disappears. So if you're like even 500 meters away from a road, the NO2 concentrations have decreased by sort of 50% or something. So when you only have a few monitors, you're not getting a continuous measurement of pollution. And they also tend to be biased to urban areas. So if the EPA is putting in a monitor, they're not going to put it necessarily in the country in Idaho, they're going to put it in the city. And so we have that issue as well. In some countries, they're just non-existent. So the United States is actually very heavily monitored compared to a lot of places. So the way we can fill these gaps is with satellite remote sensing. And satellites can provide continuous mapping, and they can provide remote monitoring. They can only measure the column amount for most gases. So that's like the total amount of nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere above a location. So it's not like we're not actually measuring the surface value. And so that's actually a very like constant field of research in our field, is like, how do we actually relate this measurement from a satellite to the column that we care, or the surface amount that we care about that people are breathing. But you can still get a lot of information from the column. And so we can measure with remote monitoring. We can measure over anywhere over the ocean, over places that don't have monitors. There's currently 8 air quality instruments in low Earth orbit, and these are measuring, so that's about 700 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. They're in polar orbit, so they're going around about 15 times a day, and they're in an orbit where it's designed to measure the same location at the same time every day. And so a couple of the instruments are measuring at about 10:30 in the morning, and the rest are measuring at about 1:30 in the afternoon. So now we're going to talk about tempo, and I'll show you the improvements that are coming with this instrument. And the exciting thing about tempo is that we're actually going to be able to measure every hour. And so we're not just measuring New York City at 1:30 in the afternoon. We're doing it every hour, and at high spatial resolution as well. But first, we'll talk about how the data is actually analyzed. So this is going to use some images from existing or previous satellites, but it's the same thing with tempo. So people are probably familiar with some of the kind of data that come out of these satellites if you've seen a map of the ozone hole. So if you've seen something like this, you might recognize this blue in the middle is the ozone hole over Antarctica. So these are weird units, Dobson units. It's like 2.69 times 10 to the 16. Well, I don't even know. I can't even remember, but it's like it's a strange unit. But basically, blue means there's not much ozone, and green means there's a lot more. So this is the Antarctic ozone hole on one day in September of 2014. You might also have seen this kind of data in the news or online recently with looking at reductions in pollution during COVID lockdowns. So it showed up in like places like the New York Times and the Washington Post. But here is data from the OMI instrument. That's a US-Dutch instrument that's been up for almost 20 years now, and our group has been working on it for a long time. This is nitrogen dioxide average for March of 2015 to 2019 over the northeastern United States. So black means there's a lot of NO2, and blue or yellow means it's pretty clean. So you can see lots over New York City, and Boston's fairly polluted. You can pick out the cities like Buffalo and Detroit. And so that's what NO2 typically looks like in March. If we go to the 2020 values, you can see a huge reduction in most places in NO2. And so these satellites have been used by a lot of people all over the world to look at pollution changes during those times, but they're also generally used to look at trends in some of this kind of data. So it's not only just like what's happening today in pollution, but how have things been changing? And the data's been collected. The first instrument like this went up in 1996, I think. So we have now a couple of decades of data. The tempo is going to add to that. So these types of measurements are made through nadir backscatter geometry. So you have a satellite that's looking down at the Earth, and you can see the path of light from the sun in this cartoon. The light is reflected or scattered off the atmosphere, the surface of the Earth, clouds, whatever, and back up to the satellite. And so what we do is retrieve the amount of the absorber, the molecule, in that path of light. So we call that the slant path, and we retrieve what we call a slant column in that path. So this is what the actual data looks like. This is from the original one of these types of instruments. GOM. And in the royal blue in the top panel is an irradiance spectrum. So about once a day, usually these instruments, and TEMPO's doing the same thing, will look directly at the sun and get a solar reference spectrum through a diffuser. The green is a radiance spectrum, and so that's what it looks like when the instrument's looking down at the Earth. And then if you ratio those two, it gets rid of all these solar features in there, and you get out a reflectance spectrum. So these are 4 different reflectance spectra. And you can see here, the top one is, so that's reflectance is 0 to 1. So the top one is about 0.8. That means that 80% of the light is being reflected back. And that is over a cloud. So, so these are the wavelengths we're using. So we're in the ultraviolet on the left. Use my pointer here. I don't think there's an actual pointer here. So this is like ultraviolet light, and then we're getting into visible, and then near infrared. And so with a cloud, clouds are white, usually, and that means they're reflecting light back of all colors. And that's why you kind of see this broad feature here, and it's bright. A desert is reddish, and it's reflecting red light back. The ocean is dark in the visible, but it's also kind of blue, and so that's why there's not much light coming back here. We've got a vegetation, 1 over vegetation. The distinctive thing here is this feature that's called the red edge. So the plant cells are the chlorophyll is using the visible light, but it's reflecting back the near infrared light. And that actually is used in remote sensing a lot to look at vegetation health. But we're really interested in are not the broad features, but these fine features, like these things here. So these are our absorption bands of various molecules. This one is water. There's oxygen here, oxygen, and a couple of water bands. And we use those in the retrieval. And then hidden in here, you can't necessarily see these by eye, but we have formaldehyde and NO2 in this kind of region. And then here, this is ozone. See that sharp fall off here with very distinct sort of ripple? That's ultraviolet absorption by ozone. Everyone learned in school early that ozone absorbs UV light, and that's its characteristic absorption that you can see there. So now, how do we actually use those spectra to derive the gases? So we fit a modeled spectrum to a measured spectrum to derive the slant column of the absorber in that path. And then we have to convert it to a vertical column. So we have like a slant column that depends on geometry, but we want to convert it to a vertical column. We use something we call an air mass factor, and that's a complicated calculation that involves geometry, radiative transfer, the surface reflectance, clouds, atmospheric scattering, the gas profile. And this is kind of a little bit confusing maybe to talk about in a short talk. Well, it's a long talk, but a short slide. But we have to this is an average photon path through a vertical layer of the atmosphere. So for a certain geometry, it's like solar zenith angle of 45 degrees and some viewing zenith angle. But it's also a function of wavelength, you'll see here. So if you have a photon at 500 nanometers coming down, it'll penetrate here mostly in a geometric way, but it doesn't always get to the surface. It's you start getting these values less than 1 or less than 2, and it's not necessarily, the average photon isn't getting to the surface. Here, this is because of ozone and molecular scattering in the UV. The average photon just doesn't make it down that far. And so to do these air mass factor calculations, you need to do calculations like this, and also you need to know where the gas is. So you need to know the profile of the gas. So different gases are distributed differently in the atmosphere, and so you need to know, is the ozone at the surface or is the ozone up high? Because if it's at the surface, we're not seeing it necessarily. Anyway, so you have to do these kind of calculations. So what we can actually measure, it depends really on, we need to have enough of the molecule, and it has to have an absorption at those wavelengths. And these are the things that we can measure with these instruments. So we can measure ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and aerosols. These are actually really useful because they're 4 of the EPA's criteria pollutants that they regulate. The others are carbon monoxide, which you can measure from infrared satellites, and lead. We can measure formaldehyde and gloxyl. Those are volatile organics. There are actually thousands of volatile organics, and we can't measure those, but when they're broken down in the atmosphere, I think, all produce formaldehyde at some point in their chemical chain. And so people use measurements of formaldehyde to infer emissions of other volatile organics. We can measure these halogens, which are important for ozone chemistry, water vapor, which is important for climate and weather, and oxygen. Oxygen's not actually that interesting as a measurement because it's, you know how much oxygen's in the atmosphere? It's 21%. But you can use it to determine the clouds in the field of view. So the sources of these kind of pollutants, these are the main products from Tempo. Nitrogen dioxide is mostly produced from burning fossil fuel. There's also natural sources from biomass burning, and some of those biomass burning can actually be, you know, agricultural, so it's human caused again. Lightning and soil emissions. Formaldehyde is usually produced by other volatile organics or the oxidation of methane, but it can also be emitted directly by industrial processes and biomass burning. The biggest source in the US is actually vegetation. So if you walk in a forest in the summer, you will smell wonderful trees, and that's actually volatile organics coming off the trees. And in the southeast, it's very hot in the summer, and the species of trees there produce a lot of isoprene, which turns into formaldehyde. Oh, sorry. And ozone is again produced, it's a secondary pollutant produced when nitrogen oxides and volatile organics react in sunlight. You can also get ozone from the stratosphere. In some high altitude places like Denver can actually come down and cause ozone pollution too, but that's not as common. And this is an example of the kind of maps you can make with these instruments. So this is Southern California. There's a lot of missing data, you'll notice. Some of that is from clouds. We can't see below clouds. So that's a big limitation with this UV visible, these UV visible retrievals. And each of these little boxes here is represents a value of the NO2 column, and each of them has come from one of those multi-wavelength spectra. So that was the OMI instrument, which was launched in 2004. And here, there's been some big improvements in the last few years with a European instrument called Tropomy, which is the one on the left. So this is an average of September 2019 from OMI. And then on the left-hand side is Tropomy. And you can see there, the signal to noise is a lot better with this instrument. The spatial resolution is very good. So it's getting to like 3.5 by 5.5 square kilometers as opposed to like 12 by 24, which is what OMI was at. So you can start to pick out a lot of features. So you see cities and power plants and roads sometimes. And Tempo has even slightly higher resolution than Tropomy, but the exciting thing about Tempo is it's going to do it every hour. So it's not just once a day anymore. So it's continuous measurements every hour. So finally, I'll talk about Tempo, but no data, sorry. So Tempo was launched on April 7th of this year from the Kennedy Space Center on a SpaceX rocket. And it is, let me see if I can get this to play, and it hopefully doesn't crash my PowerPoint like in a previous talk. So Tempo is on Intelsat 40E. It's a communications satellite. So Tempo is this box right there on the front. It disappeared already. It's about the size of a dishwasher. So here's the satellite and showing just a couple of scans. So the instrument is scanning from east to west every hour and making these continuous maps. And Intelsat 40E is a communications satellite that Intelsat does like satellite internet. And so if you're on a cruise ship or an airplane or somewhere remote, you might be using Intelsat internet. But this is an interesting project because it's the first NASA instrument to go on a communications satellite. So usually a NASA instrument would go on a NASA satellite or maybe on some other agency's satellite. But this is the first time it's gone on a communications satellite. So that's been kind of a big deal for a lot of people, figuring out how to do it for the first time. All right, so here is Tempo being integrated onto the satellite. I should say Tempo was it was built by Ball Aerospace. So I think I'm going to mention that later, actually. And then the spacecraft was built by Maxar, but for Intelsat. So we make hourly daylight observations. The resolution is about 2 by 4.75 square kilometers. That's at the center of the field. So because it's in a geostationary orbit, the resolution is defined by the angle of the viewing angle with the Earth. And so you get it, the lower latitudes like Mexico will get higher resolution, but up high, like it goes all the way up to the Canadian oil sands, it'll be lower resolution up there because of the Earth's curvature. And so as I said, the launch just happened in April, and the first measurements happened on Monday, so you're here at an exciting time, even though, yeah, you can come to my office and I'll show you, show you some spectra. So the solar irradiance was made on Monday at midnight for the first time, and it looks really good. And the Earth radiance was just made yesterday, so we're just all in the solar radiance observations look great. We've made images of the Earth with RGB images of the Earth, and now we're in the process of running it right now of doing the calculations for actually retrieving the gases. So fingers crossed. And nominal operations are hopefully going to start in October of this year. So right now it's kind of in like I don't know if you'd say manual commanding, but the commands are sent, like they say like we're going to do this day, and then they send commands. But this is when things happen where it's going to be kind of continuous. Like we scan the next day, same thing. We'll only do it during daylight, of course, because we need the sun. And then there's about 6 months of checking on the data. So we have to make sure it actually makes sense. So there's a lot of ground-based instruments in North America that we can use. There's some aircraft flights happening as we speak over Chicago and Toronto, I think, this week. And there's going to be some more in Toronto in January and New York as well. And so all that data can be taken and compared with the TEMPO data, as well as the other satellites that are already up there, to make sure that we're producing something reliable. And then once it's determined that the data is reliable and the algorithms seem to be working well, the data will go public in spring. So the project is run out of the SAO here. So the principal investigator is Kelly Chance, and the deputy PI is Sean Liu, and you may see them in the hall sometime or recognize them. So the science data processing, all the processing is being done here, and the instrument operations, so sending the commands to the spacecraft and the instrument are all done here. Intelsat is operating the instrument. The project management and the science data archiving is done by NASA Langley, so there's a very close collaboration. The instrument itself was built in Colorado by Ball Aerospace, so I know we're involved in lots of astronomy missions as well. And TEMPO is an imaging grading spectrometer, and it measures most of those wavelengths of light that I showed you earlier. So in those spectra, so the UV to the visible, and then it has 2 CCD arrays, so one doing each of these bands. So the UV visible and then visible near infrared. So the operations, again, we start on the east and then scan to the west. Uh-oh, that's my PowerPoint crash. It was that video. It did happen. All right, I won't show that again. I will skip that one. I thought it was the other movie. I've shown this one before, but that one's getting booted. Okay, I'll just verbally say that. So we have nominal operations where it scans every hour. But
Screen share or something.
Oh yeah, sorry. Good idea.
Or start from the beginning.
Yeah, so I won't show that slide. So nominal operations is scanning every hour. However, in the morning, for instance, California, our morning at 6 a.m. or something, California is dark still. And so we don't need to scan the whole continent. So you can actually get in the morning, morning time on the East Coast, you can get much higher frequency. So it can just scan, every, I'm not sure the time steps, but it'll be higher frequency in the morning on the East Coast, and then in the evening, it'll be higher frequency on the West Coast when the East Coast is dark. So, so there's going to be a little bit more information on both of those coasts at certain times of day. And then there's also a mode called special operations. So TEMPO is designed so that 25% of the time it can perform special operations. And those are like high frequency scans of a certain region. So because of the detector, one of the detector arrays is spatial, and that's the north-south direction. So there's roughly 2,000 pixels in the north-south direction. And so then for the 2,000 pixels on the array, and the other dimension of the array is spectral. So we have like 2,000 spectra for every step that the instrument makes across the field of view. And so we can scan more frequently, though, up to 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. So we're going to get the whole north-south, but we just do a little longitude band. So if there's, say, a volcanic eruption, hopefully not in the United States, but in Mexico, they regularly have a couple of volcanoes in the field of view that are erupting. So you could scan those frequently, or say forest fires, or an industrial accident, or scientists can propose for experiments. So one thing that Kelly's talked about a bit with people is if there's like nitrogen or fertilizer applications to farm fields, for instance, right before rain, you might have then more nitrogen emission after that. So scanning frequently in that area, say, or when a field campaign's happening over New York or something with aircraft, scanning New York more frequently every 5 or 10 minutes and not just every hour. So there's, if anyone has an idea, there's a form you can fill out online and suggest an experiment. So the reason that we can do these kind of high time measurements is that TEMPO is in a geostationary orbit. And so it's orbiting the Earth at the same period that the Earth is rotating. So it has to be put into this 35,786 kilometer orbit or whatever, as opposed to these low Earth orbits, orbiting missions now. This is why we can do these high frequency measurements, because it's essentially hovering over the equator so that it can just look at North America. And this is an orbit that a lot of weather satellites are in. So if you've seen these beautiful maps of hurricanes from NOAA weather satellites, these are coming from geostationary orbits. But an air quality instrument hasn't been in that before. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I think it hopefully will convince you why we need these measurements. So up in the top left corner is a chemical model of Houston's NO2. And then 2 days of OMI measurements in the middle and the right-hand panels. And it's a little confusing, but if you look at this blue line, that is the column amount of NO2 over 2 days in Houston. And TEMPO is measuring during these yellow periods. So if you look, there's a big cycle to NO2. So NO2 goes up in the morning, comes down, goes up. In the model, so this is model data showing what's going on with NO2 during the daytime. And if you look at when OMI's measuring, it's just measuring twice, right? So there's a lot happening hour to hour in NO2, twice in 2 days, once a day. So a lot is happening hour to hour in NO2. And not only can we not capture that with these current instruments, we can't, with OMI, we're actually measuring when it's at its lowest. So it's what is it, 4 times higher early in the morning during rush hour than it is in the afternoon. So it's really important to get this kind of time resolution to understand pollution thoroughly and to understand atmospheric chemistry. And this is a view of the TEMPO footprint and the kind of improvements that we'll get with the spatial resolution. So in blue, we have GOME-2, that's a European mission, the ones that are measuring in the morning right now. OMI, again, this is Washington, D.C., by the way, and a TEMPO footprint. And the tropomy mission is a little bit bigger than TEMPO, but again, it's only once a day.
What's the size of that footprint in TEMPO in terms of miles on the surface of the Earth?
Yeah, that's about in DC, it's probably about 2 by 5 square kilometers.
Sorry?
2 by 5
Square miles.
Yeah, kilometers.
Oh, kilometers.
Yeah.
Okay, so
What are all these miles things you speak?
Well, come on, you gotta talk to the real people.
I'm Canadian, so I've never used miles. I have a Canadian car too, so I don't even know how fast I'm driving. These are TEMPO synthetic retrievals. Hopefully I can show, if I was giving this talk in a month, I could show you real data. Nitrogen dioxide on the left and formaldehyde on the right. So you can see again with nitrogen dioxide, you get really localized, enhanced areas over cities. Formaldehyde looks totally different, and this is a summer formaldehyde measurement where most formaldehyde is coming from isoprene oxidation in the southeast. You'll see that, so that's the yellow stuff. You see some blue, that's low formaldehyde. That actually is not low formaldehyde. That's where we have clouds. So we can't see the formaldehyde under those clouds. But we have an algorithm in the instrument to detect clouds. And so that data is usually just removed. People don't use it unless some people are using it to try and like estimate altitude. So if you see any NO2 above the cloud, then you can get an idea of how much NO2 might be higher up as well. So that's the kind of thing we expect to see. These are some areas of impact for TEMPO. So again, public health, regulatory science. So states can say like, oh, yeah, we're in exceedance of this ozone value, but actually that's because this other state is doing something. Or they can use it to see where the sources of some pollutants are. Air pollution emissions and monitoring, air quality modeling and forecasting. So that's a kind of a new thing for some of these gases are not currently included in air quality forecast models. And so that's a new thing that hopefully TEMPO will be able to add to. Some people are interested in using some of this to look at weather analysis and forecasting. We do have water vapor measurements as well. They're not currently ready, but we will eventually. And there's also some not main products, but you can get a lot of information on vegetation and ocean color from this kind of data as well. This is a case study of, we have a couple of NO2 airborne, not NO2, TEMPO airborne simulators that NASA operates. And this was from a campaign in Houston in 2013. And they flew the instrument over in various flight tracks over Houston measuring NO2. So the Houston Ship Channel is an area with lots of petrochemical facilities. It's really polluted. And these members of the TEMPO science team used that data to correlated that data with various demographics from the census. So this one's showing median household income. So you see lots of NO2 near the Houston Ship Channel, and like no big surprise, the household income in that area is also quite low. And so there's been several papers looking at this kind of stuff, and people are really interested in using TEMPO for it to look at how NO2 and other pollutants correlate with different measures of inequality. Yes?
Sorry, what is it? Airborne?
Oh, so it's the instrument put on an aircraft. Oh, okay. Yeah, so basically like a test bed. So that's, at least in earth sciences, that's fairly common. Like before you build the ocean color or soil moisture instrument, you would have a smaller version that's put on an aircraft first to kind of test out algorithms and instrumentation. And so these authors determined that over Houston at least, and they've redone the study for data taken in 2021, and with pretty much the exact same results. Low-income non-white neighborhoods see about 40% more NO2 than high-income white neighborhoods. And this is quite consistent. It varies a little bit city to city, but it's pretty consistent all across the United States in all the data they've looked at. Also, we have these experimental opportunities, again, that I talked about. So looking at volcanoes or forest fires, things like that. TEMPO's not up there by itself. There's an instrument called GEMS that was launched by the Korean National Institute for Environmental Research in 2020. And it's a very similar instrument to TEMPO. It was also built by Ball Aerospace, and we've had a lot of collaborations with them. The PI was on sabbatical here for a year, and we share algorithms and a lot of postdocs who come. And so TEMPO is really part of a global constellation. The European Space Agency is also launching an instrument called Sentinel-4 in 2024 that will be monitoring North Africa and Europe with very similar technology. There are big parts of the world that are missing, though. That's the problem with geostationary, is that you can't necessarily measure everything. And if we wanted to also measure South America at the same time, we'd need an instrument that was twice as expensive. And so we have this data this is some example data from the GEMS instrument, and this is what hopefully TEMPO will be producing tomorrow when I start working on it. And so you can see NO2 over Asia, and you can pick out all these cities, and there's lots of like individual. China obviously has a lot of industry and population in this area. You can pick out power plants and roads in many places and cities. The data from TEMPO will be completely publicly available starting in the spring. And some people in the education group here are working on how to make that more accessible for the public, because right now it is a lot of data. So we're producing like a couple terabytes of data a day, and you don't want to necessarily look at all that, but it is a lot of data, and so just making it easier to use is a goal here. And then just finally, I wanted to show a little bit about public engagement at the Center for Astrophysics. This is led by Erica Wright and Mary Dussault in the Science Education Group. I think Erica's in a meeting that I'm supposed to be in right now, and so she's not here. But she's has got a project called Best AQI, which is involving teens in conducting their own air quality investigations, and it has a lot of museums and education centers across the country who are interested in collaborating on this. Also, Eric has been co-leading a network of ozone bioindicator gardens. So ozone is damaging to vegetation. You can see several examples here. This is certain varieties of these plants. So not necessarily every variety will respond the same to ozone. So some are quite ozone resistant. So there's a network of ozone gardens around the country to sort of engage people in how air quality affects plants and vegetation. These gardens will have like different species of the same plant. So they'll have two kinds of potatoes or something. And then people who visit can see the damage on a particular potato variety and another one that's not damaged from ozone. And there's some information about the amount of ozone in the air from how much damage there is on these plants as well. And this is an example of the different organizations, or a map of the different organizations that are involved. So in blue are organizations who are interested in partnering in the Best AQI initiative or project, and then the locations of ozone gardens in the lower left corner. So hopefully, I think I finished right on time. Hopefully you have, if you hadn't thought about it much before, or you just thought about the wildfires, you have now a more thorough understanding of what is in the air you breathe. And next time I give this talk, some of you won't be here, I will show some real data in a year or two. Yeah, thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you again. Does anybody have any questions for our speaker? Jonathan.
So you say you don't observe at night, obviously, but do you do any like dark current calibration or anything like that?
Yeah. So yeah, dark current has done it before the observations are made every day. Yeah.
And is that, can you detect at all things like artificial light at night?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And actually, the expert on that is visiting our group for a month right now. So there's a scientist, Jim Carr, who wrote a paper on using tempo to measure artificial lights at night. So theoretically, yes, it can be done. So I think the tempo, something to do, I am not good on this, like it's for spacecraft safety, you can't have it, or for instrument safety, it can't be like observing at certain angles at certain times. And so it's a bit limited. It can't just like look at North America all night or anything. So I think it's like right after sunset. Yeah. So it's like, kind of, maybe you can get over to the East Coast when it's dark and it's dusk on the West Coast or something, but it's not like, we can't look at it all night long. There are instruments that are designed, very well for that. Like the VEERS instrument is a NOAA instrument that makes very high resolution measurements of artificial lights at night. But tempo, because it's hyperspectral, VEERS just observes certain spectral channels. Tempo is interesting because we could possibly differentiate different types of lighting. And so it's not the best instrument for like high resolution measurements of light like VEERS is, but you could possibly get information about the types of light. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm interested in your analysis because you said in order, as I understand, in order to interpret your reflective, your scattered spectrum, you have to know the structure of the atmosphere because you have to know if the one gas is high and one is low. But that's what you're trying to determine.
Yeah,
so,
I know. So
How does that
That's
work?
what I spend my life doing. So we're measuring a column amount,
Right,
but yes,
columns,
we
yes,
have to
columns.
we have to make an assumption about the profile, and so ozone is the only one that has some profile information, and that is because I don't know if you remember that photon path length one a figure I showed. Ozone has a different photon path average penetration depth depending on wavelength. Because it has such a sharp cutoff in the UV, like this wavelength, it doesn't penetrate, and this one it does. And so there's actually information you can get on the height.
Spectral information.
Yeah, but that's only for ozone. So we can actually derive an ozone profile product from tempo, but there's not nitrogen dioxide or formaldehyde. So we make assumptions about the atmosphere, and that is a fairly large uncertainty. The information we use is from the NASA global modeling forecast. So there's a NASA chemical forecast that's produced for every hour, and so
Across
we
the United States? I mean,
across the world.
Same
Yeah.
spatial resolution?
The spatial resolution's not as good. It's 25 by 25 kilometers, and so that, in a way, degrades our spatial resolution. So that is that's a complicated thing to deal with. But as models get, as computational power gets better, the models are getting higher and higher resolution. And hopefully at some point they'll be coming down. Then we'll be getting higher resolution. But yeah, so I typically estimate in these products about a 10% accuracy, error or uncertainty and accuracy from the profile shape. Yeah. So
Well, maybe
that's
you can also measure variation. So in other words, you might not know exactly what the number is, but you might know that, it's higher by a factor of 5 over Boston than it is over Watertown. Or
yeah.
Okay.
So is that how you could tease out vertical transport?
So the vertical information can only happen from in the ozone profile product. So the other ones don't have that because they don't lie in a region with really sharp change in wavelength or sharp change in the photon penetration depth as a function of wavelength, and so we can't get information on those.
So when you mentioned about the interaction with the clouds, wasn't that essentially a filtering of
Yeah.
transport?
So the cloud retrieval, actually we can retrieve the cloud height, and so that's something that also goes into it. We're like, okay, so we know if the cloud is here, then the profile looks like this. It's very complicated.
Along these lines, the path you're measuring the absorption through is the down and the back.
Yeah.
So at different times of day, you get different information on the down part.
Yes.
Well, so of course, if nothing changed in time, which of course is the whole point,
Yeah.
does that let you tease out some vertical information?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that anyone has used that too. I'm not sure.
That's right.
I mean, in these, yeah. I don't.
Gradients angles, which are sort of teasing?
The problem is that these species change as well. So even nitrogen dioxide in the stratosphere or ozone, it's interacting with sunlight, right? So you have sunlight coming in at certain angles, and those profiles are changing during the day as well. So if it was a fixed profile all the time, so it's not even like just the pollution on the surface that's changing. The gases higher up, those are also changing with sunlight as well.
Right.
They also have a diurnal cycle too.
This, after a few years of coverage, maybe you've got enough data to time series information to put something in.
So there are instruments that look in the limb that are really good for profiling in the upper atmosphere. So those are quite useful for that area anyway. It's the stuff down near the bottom that we find really hard to figure out the profile.
When you mentioned scanning, is that a mechanical device?
Yeah.
Or is that, so
Yeah.
your instrument is doing this
Yes.
every hour?
Yeah.
Or what's the life cycle of this, you think?
You can ask Sean that question. I don't know, but I mean, I think
Over a decade.
theoretically longer than the spacecraft lifetime, which is 15 years.
Presumably it's like a pick-off mirror or something that's moving, not the whole
Yeah, yeah.
I had a question about that too, sorry. Monopolizing. But I saw some, in one of the images from a different satellite, obviously, there was some pixelization of the, you could see little squares, and they presumably they move by one width, and then move by another width. Can you subsample, so you have many samples, and then you can get out more information?
Yeah, you can. So the one on the one that I showed was OMI. That's a CCD array, and it actually doesn't have a scanning mechanism. So its spatial is determined by the fact it's a 2D array detector. And then, so one spatial dimension is one of the dimensions of the detector, and the other one is from the motion of the satellite. So TEMPO doesn't have that motion, so it has the scanning. Other instruments that produce data like OMI actually have a scanning. So the GOM2 instrument actually scans as a photodiode array that's not 2D. So, and it just scans back and forth. But that's a good question. We do it a different way though. So what happens with like OMI instrument, or what happens with TEMPO, is when you have multiple orbits or multiple scans of North America, you can use that. It's never the same coverage. So there's jitter in the instrument. It's never pointing at exactly this area of New York City. It's a little shifted. And so we use oversampling algorithms to get that resolution down. So with TEMPO, we can probably, with enough data, get down to sort of like the 1 kilometer resolution, and with enough averaging. But then you lose that temporal coverage. So.
What is the cadence that you take a radiant spectra of the sun? And I'm wondering could there be an issue if there are like short-term changes in the sun spectrum? If you look at the sun and then say like a spot begins to rotate in front of it, and then you look down at the Earth and like the spectrum that you're comparing to the Earth is like different. Does that make sense?
I feel like that's a question for the astronomers. But we measure once a day.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly. We have a lot of like. So we're measuring once a day. I don't know how much the sun actually would change. It's like, but we do have. They're probably. We fit like polynomials in the fitting that there's a lot of uncertainties. So like there's uncertainties in like instrument calibration and like aerosol scattering. We don't even consider that, and that's like usually broad features with some wavelength dependency. So we're fitting background polynomials in this as well. So that may take care of some, like I'm actually, for one of the instruments I work on, it's a NOAA instrument, I use the same sun spectrum from 2012 for like 10 years, and it actually produces okay results. So it might have some effect, but I think it's probably taken care of by some other fitting parameter. Yeah.
I suspect if you have a flare that's big enough to significantly change the integrated spectrum of the whole sun, we've got other problems.
Yes. I think the founder of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory spent many years measuring the solar constant, it was called, and it didn't change.
Langley?
It was kind of a null result, really.
Yeah.
For a waste of time, but you've got to establish it. So it's really that the sun is there as a nice constant source, and you use it to see changes in the instrument by observing it every day.
Yeah, and any kind of uncertainties, when we ratio these two together, the uncertainties in our instrument, like calibration issues, those are often canceled out, so that's very helpful.
Are there any more questions? I did have one. It was about one of your slides, and maybe this is an obvious answer, but it was with the OMI instrument, and it was comparing GOM and OMI.
Oh yeah, tropomy and OMI.
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
And I know you said the spatial resolution is different, but one of them, like I just noticed Virginia, was like very dark red in one, and like a nice color in the other one.
Oh really?
So I was like, why would they be so vast? Like they were different ends of the spectrum. I don't know. Maybe you could go back. Maybe I saw that wrong. But it was like in the middle, I think, somewhere.
Hopefully it's not right. I'm not going to crash it again with
Oh
my
yeah,
video.
that one video, yeah.
Oh, that one there.
No, it was, no,
Yeah,
no.
that's a good question.
Oh, yes, this is it, yes.
That's a good question. Yeah, it doesn't
Like,
actually look
Virginia's like all dark
Yeah, yeah,
red, and this one, it's like
So-
mostly blue.
So OMI has been has had degradation in the last few years, and so some of its data in 2019 might not be as great. This actually probably illustrates a lot of the biases in these satellite retrievals. There's actually a lot of effort being made right now to make interconsistent data sets. So especially from different retrievals, from different retrieval teams, it can often produce differences of like 50% in nitrogen dioxide. And that comes mainly from assumptions in the air mass factor. So like they use different surface reflectivity databases, or they use different models of aerosol scattering in the atmosphere, or they use different profiles from different models. And so the uncertainties can be very large. And so this is probably a bit of a bias. I'll refer you to this guy. That's a good question, though.
I did. I had more of a geopolitical question. So I assume that the map extends into Canada and Mexico. Do you need agreement from those countries to take the data, and do they want the data?
So no, we don't get agreement from anybody to take the data. So they're gonna have their data taken. So these satellites that have been orbiting for 25 years, ozone hole monitoring instruments that have been monitoring for decades now, 40 years, they collect data, but there's no. If you had to get the agreement if you had to get the agreement of 200 countries to monitor pollution, yeah, there'd definitely be some people who say no. But yeah, that's not done. So, but Canada and Mexico are actually, one of our Mexican colleagues is here sitting in the front row. He's visiting us right now. So Canada and Mexico are really interested in the data, and one of the great things for them is they didn't have to pay for it. So they didn't have to pay for tempo or launch tempo, but they get the benefits of having all of this data as well. And so a lot of scientists and government agencies are interested in using the data to better understand air quality.
Okay, I think, Matt, you'll be the last
Yeah,
question.
just like kind of about that, you mentioned briefly that like you would need twice as expensive or double the instrument to do South America as well. Is there ever a plan to just like take a little data down there and see what's up?
Yeah, we can't do that. So yeah, the optics can't be. So we have like a couple of degrees of leeway where like you could go a little farther south or a little farther north, but we can't unfortunately go the whole way down. That would be cool if we could do that, but yeah, we can't. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, and let's thank our speaker again.
Thanks. Oh, good.
So we should fill in this form?
Yeah, well, it's probably more closer to the time, so you don't need a
It's
lot
not like
of
we have the answers, we have to respond to the
No,
proposal.
it's like, no. I mean, maybe